All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar for this new year, the webinar series on researching the far right method and ethics. This webinar series is co-organized by the Reactionary Politics Research Network, the Center for Alternative to Social and Economic Inequalities, and the Center for Research on Extremism. And this webinar series aims to initiate and facilitate a discussion about all the issues and challenges that arise when researching the far right. So far right parties, movement, violent action, and including, of course, the methodological and ethical challenges of doing this kind of research. So the topic addressed in this webinar series are based on the volume The Ethic of Researching the Far Right, Critical Approaches and Reflection, published by Manchester University Press and edited by Antonia Vaughan, Joanne Brown, Megan Tinsley, and Aurélia Mondon. And today's webinar will focus on the themes and issue of the part 4 of the book, The Ethics of Researching the Far Right, so about care and safety. So researching the far right, as you may know, or as you may learn today, involves methodological, emotional, and safety risk. So the author presenting here today will consider harm, risk, and care in reference to the researcher themselves, to the research community, and to the participant. So they will interrogate practices of care and safety throughout the research process and the particular structures of evaluating and managing harm. The speaker will discuss and reflect on different issues using example on their research and personal experiences conducting it. So let me first present our panelists. So first today we will have a presentation by Tamta Galashvili at the University of Oslo and Iris Seger at the University of Oslo too on the ethic of care. This will be followed by a presentation by Luc Cousineau from Dalhousie University on meta-ethical negotiation. And then we'll conclude with a presentation by Caleb Preston from the University of Toronto on community building. So each of them will discuss during 15 to 18 minutes, and then this will be followed by a discussion and a Q&A session. So please, if you have any question at any time during this webinar, please write them down in the Q&A section and not in the chat. In the Q&A section, it will be easier for us to address all of them at the end of the webinar. So I will first present Iris and Tamta while they use this time to share their screen. So Tamta Galashvili is a new doctor of political science from the University of Oslo. She's affiliated with CREX, and her doctoral research focused on far-right social movement in hybrid regimes with a focus on Georgia and Ukraine. And her research interests includes nationalism, social movement, and far-right protest and violence. She will be presenting with Iris Seger, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Research for Gender Research and CREX at the University of Oslo. Her research focuses on far-right politics of knowledge, anti-trans and anti-gender mobilization, threats and harassment against academic, and methodological and ethical challenges in research on the far right. So Tamta and Iris, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Audrey. Sorry, my Zoom just crashed. I hope it doesn't happen again. Yes, thank you very much for this lovely introduction that I mostly missed. I'm sure it was fantastic. Let me start by sharing my screen. This is a little bit more messy than anticipated. Already, let's see. Oh, okay, does that work? All good? Yes. Yeah. So. Thanks again for the invitation. Today, Tomta and I will be presenting some thoughts from an essay that we wrote together, also co-authored with Audrey, who's also here today. This essay stems from not just us working together as colleagues, but also from the various conversations we have had together about researching the far right. And over the course of the last few years, we in fact find ourselves in very good company when it comes to a sort of ongoing conversation about the role of the researcher in researching the far right and the potential impact of this kind of research on the well-being of the scholar themselves. So we find, and I'm just going to show you a small selection here, a number of publications and reflections on the particular ethical challenges of doing this kind of work, specifically focused on well-being when researching groups and movements that maybe have views that are illiberal, perhaps hostile, or even potentially violent. We find, for example, the work of Antonia Von, who's written about institutional barriers and challenges stemming from ethical frameworks that we work with at our institutions. Here we have the chapter by Christian Fuchs with the wonderful title, Dear Mr. Neo-Nazi, can you please give me your informed consent so that I can quote your fascist tweet, here addressing some challenges related to digital research ethics and acquiring informed consent in particular. Adrienne Massanari has written about challenges related to visibility and risk in researching the alt-right. And Tamta and Audrey have published on the experiences of women researching far-right actors. And again, this is a very small selection, but we find ourselves in good company also within the context of this webinar. So what we want to talk about today are just a few points from this essay published last year in Feminist Media Studies, in which we aim to raise some awareness about the need for care for the researchers, based on perspectives borrowed from the ethics of care. And then relating this to research on the far right specifically. So we also view these problems through the lens of intersectionality, a term originally coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and that is today used quite broadly and widely to refer to the combined impact of various structures of inequality on the legal, political, social treatment of individuals in society. And when we apply this notion to researchers on the far right, this intersectional lens highlights the ways in which the risk of harm may be unequally distributed through scholars' combined positions on these various axes of inequality, including, of course, gender identity, sexuality, and race ethnicity. So a little bit about care ethics or ethics of care. These are perspectives that originate in the early 80s. When Carol Gilligan's work entitled In a Different Voice was published. In this book, Gilligan challenges some dominant interpretations of ethical and moral reasoning at the time. What she develops in this book is this perspective on what she calls a different voice, a different way of moral reasoning that she found was adopted mostly by women in her research participants. Where their moral reasoning was focused more on relationships and caring relationships in particular, rather than the application of sort of broader, more abstract principles that we find more in deontological and utilitarian ethical approaches. Since the publication of this work, ethics of care has been developed further widely in various directions. Virginia Held has played an important role in this. And she uses the term ethics of care in a plural sense to account for these different approaches. And Held argues that various scholars in the field think ethics of care are rather a mosaic of insights and values, in the sense that it does not make the sort of grand universal claims that we find in, again, deontological and utilitarian ethical theories. And therefore it can't be captured as easily as a very concrete theory. But even so, Virginia Held argues there are some important similarities between different approaches that together make up the moral theory of what we call care ethics, ethics of care, or feminist ethics of care, used quite interchangeably. Now, most importantly, and in line with Gilligan's seminal work, care ethics or ethics of care place more emphasis on the relational dynamics and nature of ethical and moral decision-making, and the moral significance of caring relationships in general. Again, which makes it quite different from deontological ethical approaches that apply more abstract principles of justice, fairness, equality, etc., on concrete moral decision-making. This, however, doesn't mean that ethics of care does not pay attention to, for example, these broader ethical principles of justice and fairness, but that it situates these decisions in the context of human relations. So in this essay, we draw from three of these main features of the broader field of ethics of care as a lens to view research on the far right. And the principles that we highlight in this essay are the importance of human relations, contextual, the nature of decision-making, and the role of emotions. And in this talk, we're going to focus mostly on this aspect of relationality and emotions. And I think on that note, I will now hand over to my colleague Tanta.
Thank you, Iris. I hope you can hear me well. Yes? Okay. Yes, so picking up on where Iris stopped, we start to look at ethical guidelines that are often used to guide our research. And these contemporary guidelines on research ethics are grounded in this so-called reflexive turn in social sciences that took place in the 1970s. And what this turn meant was that it questioned this positivist emphasis on objectivity or value-free science, and instead encouraged researchers to acknowledge the basis of social scientists in colonialist legacy. So the argument was that the production of knowledge inherently entails unequal power relations. It is the researcher that treats humans as data subjects. It is the researcher. Excuse me, there is a certain small human in our. I hope you can hear me still. I moved you to my microphone. So the argument is that there's inherently unequal power relations involved, where it is the researcher that formulates the questions, it is the researcher that interprets and communicates the answers from the respondents. So then what the reflexive turn suggested was that because researchers are inherently in the position of power, they should try to reflect on this power, hence be reflexive, and then focus on minimizing this power and rather give voice to those that they research, so their respondents. But the problem with this framework was that it was very much influenced by fieldwork accounts of white Western researchers, most of whom were men. So there is this assumption of static and hierarchical relationship where the researcher is by definition powerful and the respondent is inherently powerless. Of course, this is not really how research necessarily goes. In fact, informants can exercise power depending on how they perceive the researcher's ethnic identity, gender, sexuality, class, age, and so on and so forth. So then these guidelines on reflexivity, they fail to acknowledge that researchers are not necessarily in a more powerful position vis-a-vis their participants. And so this ethical imperative to minimize your own power can be irrelevant in some contexts and can even be dangerous in certain contexts. So for instance, in far-right settings, if you minimize your power too much as a woman, for instance, or as a researcher of color, you might be vulnerable to harassment, unwanted sexual advances, and so on and so forth. So there is already a body of literature that looks at this. So for instance, in the 2020 volume on research methods on the far right, there were chapters looking at researchers of color studying far-right communities or women researchers looking at far-right communities. And in the work that Audrey and I did that Iris mentioned, we talked to women researchers working on the far right who emphasized risks related to safety, related to emotional work, and the risks that are exacerbated by the lack of institutional support. So moving on to Iris, if you can move to the last slide, thank you. So what this all implies is that we need to empower researchers to protect themselves rather than uniformly advising them to minimize their own power. So as I mentioned before, these guidelines often emphasize the need to minimize the researcher's own power and protect the respondents. So there's an overly large emphasis on the safety of respondents, which is of course important. But when researchers, in this situation, then researchers are often de-emphasized. And when they are mentioned and their safety is highlighted as important, then the focus is very much on physical safety. And so then you would see guidelines on how to protect yourself physically, like not going alone into a field that you don't know, having someone that you can call if danger arises, and so on and so forth, maybe knowing the field well before you enter it, things like this. But the other part of this risk, which is the emotional and mental load, is often very much ignored. And this is what feminist care ethics emphasizes, that we should consider not only physical aspect of this, but also the emotional and mental risks, because this work often entails emotional toll. Researching the far right involves significant emotional labor, and that's related not only to forming relationships with individuals that have far right views. These might be people that you absolutely do not agree with, Or it can also entail exposure to hateful content, and especially for those that are directly targeted by this ideology. So people with minoritized backgrounds like women, LGBTQ plus individuals, people of certain ethnicities and religions and so on, they may be especially targeted and affected. So what are the implications of this? And we can move to the last slide. Thank you. So first and foremost, we suggest in our essay that we should rethink and expand ethical guidelines to accurately reflect the power dynamics involved in research, but also to reflect on both physical and emotional risks that are involved in this research. And then second, we very often see that whenever such risks are discussed, it is often very individualized. So the advice against those risks is very individualized. So researchers are asked to think about their projects well in advance. They're asked to plan how to mitigate risks, take breaks, practice yoga, mindfulness, things like this, which are of course very important for researchers' well-being, but they are also very centered on individuals themselves. So the implication of this is that institutional responsibility is often not acknowledged enough or is ignored. And we argue that institutions can actually play an extremely important role in not only preventing, but also dealing with some of the harms that we are talking about, and some other research has identified that's related to this work. And then third, by extension, this also means countering the neoliberal logic that academia is increasingly moving towards, with its focus on first individualized work, but also on research productivity at all costs. And this research productivity defined in a very certain specific way. So this logic of publish or perish that disproportionately affects people in their early careers. And of course, these are at the same time people that are most often those that engage with these dangerous populations most directly in their research. So as a result, they cannot really afford to prepare well enough for their research projects sometimes, or to reflect on what worked and what didn't after the research project is over before they have to jump into the next project. So then these kind of criticisms are in a way interrelated with this criticism of neoliberal focus of academia. And this is where we end the presentation, but I'm happy to continue the discussion in the Q&A, of course. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamta and Iris. I think that this was a great presentation and that you raised very important issues and provided practical implication as well, and solution as well, potential solutions that are really important. So thank you for being here with us. I know that Iris asked to leave at some point, so I will thank you right now, Iris, for being here today with us. And if anyone has questions for Iris and Tamta, please you can write them in the Q&A section, and Tamta will stay with us to address them at the end of the webinar. So now for the second presentation, we have Luc Cousineau. So he is the co-director of the research at the Canadian Institute of Far-Right Studies and an instructor in the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies at Dalhousie University. Their work focuses on the intersection of masculinity, technologies, and power, and the influence of far-right masculinism on social structures and youth. So Luc, you can go whenever you're ready.
Thank you. I thought for a long time about stimulating visuals to go with my talk and came up real empty. So you're gonna get my reading face as I read what I've prepared. And if I pause partway through and add things, it's because listening to Iris and Tamta's talk made me think about a few different things, and things that we've been discussing quite readily at the Canadian Institute for Far-Right Studies, or CIFRS, around particularly emotional well-being for especially precarious faculty and students who are doing this work. And that work at CIFRS has been really sort of pushed by Amy Mack, my colleague there, who I'm actually going to mention again in a minute. But let me just move my text down here so that I'm actually looking at you and not staring off into space. So coming up to this talk, I've been thinking a lot about what discussions of ethics do to us and for us as we think about the difficult work that we engage with. And And so, like, do I have clean answers for you about this? No. I mean, that's why we're having these talks, I think. But I'm hoping to be able to name some of these challenges in the way that I have been encountering them, if for no other reason than to give myself a better way to talk about them. For context, my work in this area really begins on men's rights and red pill groups on Reddit. That was my dissertation, but has since expanded to the larger influence of the manosphere and masculinist grifters, sort of both extreme and not extreme. And I'm currently working on three separate projects, actually, about how these communities in particular and online misogyny are impacting school classrooms and teachers. One of those is on Reddit, and one is here in Canada with White Ribbon. And the other one is with some colleagues in New Zealand under their Preventing Violence and Extremism Fund. Um, I've also moved into doing work about how mis and disinformation are impacting the ways that folks are taking in, reacting to, and reproducing anti-SOGI, so sexual orientation and gender identity ideas. So they're anti-teaching those things in schools, for example. Especially in rural parts of Canada, and then specifically in Nova Scotia, where I'm situated, and in Alberta, where Amy Mack is situated, and in BC, where Mariel Cooksey, our executive director at Cyphers, is situated. And I don't think I need to explain to the folks gathered here today how those things are all linked to the far and extreme right. And I'm thinking here really specifically about like anti-trans rhetoric that's essential to this anti-SOGI content. And we're seeing now bills moving through provincial legislatures here in Canada, particularly anti-trans focused material. And I've also been working, although admittedly very slowly, on writing about what I call a soft entree into masculinism. And that factors really importantly into my thinking and discussion of ethical praxis. And you'll see that sort of as I get into this here. So today I really want to talk about the intersections of care, and if you see similar themes that are when I'm talking about care to the previous presentation, it was really interesting to me to talk about that because I'm going to talk about it from sort of another angle. So care, safety, and the ethical imperatives that we have as we try to work on communities and people that we have a problem with. So for me, that means men's rights and other masculinist communities, but of course extends into all elements of the far and extreme right, since this really is where my communities of interest invariably wind up anyway. I'm particularly fond of using Fielding's idea of unloved communities to talk about these groups, but each researcher speaking today and other folks in attendance will have their own ways of referring to them. And I think regardless of where you situate them, what you call them or how you think about them, these unloved communities create for us a series of personal and ethical dilemmas, which are significant enough that they generate books like the one that we're sort of talking about today, that, papers, discussions at conferences, new conferences altogether. And I think sometimes keep people out of this line of research altogether, right? Everybody that's engaged in it knows it can be really hard, can be really challenging. And these ethical dilemmas are important, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But before that, I think we need to talk about the self of the researchers. And this was also in the previous presentation. If you're thinking, did these people coordinate? We did not. But the notions of self factor in significant ways, sort of within research informed by feminism. And I don't mean just explicitly feminist research, but I do certainly mean to imply that the common practice of research or self-reflection has its roots in feminist praxis. The turn to reflexivity that you just heard about. This reflexivity allows for us to place ourselves in the world and the research. And I stand on the shoulders of others when I say that this type of thing matters in all research, but I think especially in places like those that we're talking about today. I mean, I am who I am, and that really matters, even beyond the kind of self-affirmation that I get to feel when I say I am who I am. I bring this up to do two things. The first is to ensure that you understand that I understand the ways that I discuss these issues come from the physical, social, and economic places that I inhabit. And while I believe them to be important approaches to building a better world, that's sort of the approaches that I take, building a better world for the most people, they aren't always accessible to others. So the ways that I am and the ways that I do things just aren't possible for many of my colleagues, for example, women of color. I blend in better, which isn't great, but is functional sometimes. And because of that, I'm often less of a target. Um, the second is to acknowledge that who you are and how you show up really matter. I study the internet, but I don't really use social media in a way that's attached to my kind of fleshy life beyond my use of Blue Sky. I also don't really have close family connections, at least that I know of, who are engaged in the spaces that I study and write about. That provides me with a certain distance, even if I might be mistaken at times for someone researching the far right in the positive, which has happened. I don't. And a distance that I'm grateful for, especially considering, for example, my partner and my young child, they don't do this work, and they certainly don't deserve to be dragged into anything that my work might bring home. Um, Other researchers and people who I consider to be exceedingly brave take different approaches, including my close colleague at Cypher's, Amy Mack, who's taken on the incredibly difficult challenge of doing ethnographic research on the far right as it's implicated in the place where she grew up and lives still. Um, who we are impacts in direct and important ways the way that we think about care and how we think about safety in the work that we do. And whether you're disconnected, sort of as best you can be, or directly connected to your research spaces, your concepts of care and safety are tied up in a kind of what I think of as a meta-ethical negotiation. And what I mean by that is it's a negotiation between activism, care, and responsibility and the ethical interactions of those things. So first, you are an activist. By engaging in this work and thinking critically about the roles of the far right and extremism in the lives of people, you're engaging in activist labor. Whether you're engaging in what Lexi DeConing calls critical empathy for your research subjects, something that I've been doing as I theorize this idea of soft entree into masculinism, or you find them abhorrent, or somewhere in between, I guess, your study of and the work of people in these spaces has activist tendencies. You're not doing this work just for the lulz, or at least I don't think you are anyway. As an activist, you have a certain imperative, right? You're trying to make something happen through your work. And the making something happen has, sort of as a part of it, a set of ethical decisions and conditions. Second, you care. Connected, of course, to your activism is the fact that you care. And it might again be about the people you're studying, but it may also be for the good of others, considering the people that you study might hurt or kill those more vulnerable than them, which is, of course, a problem. Um, this care, named often as a feminist ethics of care, and we heard a bit about this in the previous presentation, I talk about this in my chapter in the book, is about ensuring that the work that you are doing has care for the people you study and the world in mind. Are you doing harm? And this is a different question than whether they are doing harm. The ethical imperative when discussing care is, of course, different than that of doing activism, since the broad application of the idea of care applies to even those you may not agree with. And I think it's worth mentioning here that while I'm staunchly against the rhetorics and ideas of the people I study in principle, and I might get a bit excited in my prose about what I think they should do with most of those ideas, I would not wish them actual physical harm, even if this would really only mirror the actual harm that they might wish upon me or might actually do to myself or others. To wish upon them actual physical harm would violate my own ethical position on such things. Although I have to say that my ethical position about harm to reputation or self-esteem might not be quite so stringent. The ethics of caring then may come into conflict with my ethics of activism. And last, you are responsible. So this responsibility goes beyond your essential responsibility as a researcher to whatever length you will allow it to. If you're one to sort of take on the weight of the world, then your ethics of responsibility will make it very difficult to critique, fight against, care for, and support all aspects of the complex area that we all explore. If your responsibility extends only onto those you research, as a finite interpretation of a researcher ethics of care might do, then you risk the ethical problem of forsaking the larger social space as a result. And if you're only focused on those that you get data from, then you might not see the forest for the trees in the ways that their work and actions impact the larger social space. So if your ethics of responsibility is about the wider social space and ignores the individual, then you might risk putting the individual you study at risk by potentially devaluing their life. To be responsible is always complicated, and I think doubly or triply so here. So this for me becomes a meta-ethical problem. It's these layers of ethical problem on top of one another. And this balancing of activism, care, and responsibility, it doesn't have an easy solution. And if it did, well, I mean, we wouldn't be here having these talks, right? So you're called then to figure out what balance between these elements is the one that resonates with you. As I laid out in my chapter, while the needs of the individual are important, I, on a personal level, can set aside the need to obfuscate my providers of data as they've posted their information in what I consider to be the public sphere. The use of that problematic term notwithstanding for the moment. This allows me then to make the considered move in my own ethical imperative to be more expository in my writing, sharing usernames and quotes verbatim. But I think this is a specific situation where I've determined that the posts are public, of course. I think people knowing exactly what is said and potentially by whom, if they're identifiable in that way, coming out of this public space, is the best decision for a world that the most people can live in the best way possible. Even with justification, though, this decision is sometimes fraught, as it is with a new paper that I have under review with a journal in Australia, where direct quotes and the use of usernames pulled from online forums is no longer permitted. The question that I'll leave you with then is when you encounter the situation where after you've done careful consideration of positions that you believe to be defensible morally and ethically, having done the research and thinking, required to support this position under scrutiny, what do you do when somebody tells you that you can't do it that way? We've decided that you have to do it this way. How do you then renegotiate this meta-ethical problem that you have worked so hard to solve? That's a position that we were in. We took one approach to doing it, but I think it really, for me, sort of encapsulates how are we negotiating these layers of ethical difficulty? And I wonder how you might do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luke. That was a great presentation. I think it, once again, really important question were raised about the ethic of care, but also the ethics of responsibility, and this idea that who we are impact the way that we think about care and safety. I think that this is really important. But also, are you doing harm by researching these populations? I think that this is another important question. Okay, so our final presentation is by Kala Preston. So she is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto. And her areas of interest include student activism, gender, political sociology, and race. Currently, she is conducting research on youth activism in Canada and the United States. So she's interested in why and how young people decide to get involved in social and political organizing. So Kyla, you can go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I just want to start by thanking, obviously, the organizers of this webinar. It's been really fantastic to get to hear all the great research that's being done. And obviously my presentation is really connected to community. So it's great to have this space. And the edited collection has been such an amazing resource for doing this work. I just want to start by saying kind of thank you for the introduction, Audrey. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto. And I have just left, actually, field work. I've been doing field work for a year and a half, ethnographic and life history field work, looking at student activists, including student activists and actors, including those on the right and the far right, both in Canada and the United States. So these conversations are extremely prevalent, obviously, to my research, and I'm sure to many who are joining us here today. So a neglected topic in research ethics and qualitative and quantitative research in the social science is that around self-care, emotional, and often physical trauma that comes along with doing research. And this is particularly salient when engaging in research that can be emotionally draining, traumatizing, or taxing. Researchers on the far right have highlighted the potential experience of such problems, as we have seen this webinar and throughout the course of the webinar series. For example, far-right researchers have far-right groups rather have created multiple platforms, often to expose researchers and professors who they believe threaten their ideology. A very prominent one was the Professor Watch List, which I believe still exists at Turning Points, which highlighted professors who expose, quote, left-wing propaganda. So I argue on this paper, and I apologize, I didn't realize that my slides were kind of skewed, that traditional often coping strategies are often insufficient when dealing with this type of research. And this is because they rely on individualizing research, emotional labor, which has been spoken about in the last two presentations, without often addressing the underlying isolation of the research enterprise. Ultimately, then, I conclude by saying that community building and membership provide better solutions to research stress as they mediate above problems of other types of coping strategies that have been reviewed in other research. So I'm going to begin by addressing the importance of community building and support in researching the far right. And what follows is a discussion on how some of the pitfalls of other forms of self-care and emotional labor, research ambivalence, and how this can be alleviated by community building. And I'll also be discussing how privilege obviously influences access to care as well. So a primary sector of support for many researchers is research community. And research has found that writing retreats, peer mentorship, and good supervising or mentorship create nurturing and supportive spaces for researchers to share ideas and challenges in both the writing and the research process. And this is especially important for early career researchers or those who may be marginalized in the research space. Understanding ourselves as researchers as part of a collective can also be highly beneficial, especially in often isolating work such as the academy. Alongside often peer research communities, studies have also shown the importance of mentorship for researchers and clinicians, especially those who may experience additional boundaries due to racism, sexism, transphobia, and xenophobia. Individuals who have supportive mentors are also more likely to combat research loneliness and career loneliness, and are more likely to be able to access resources to improve their work environments. Community is an important factor in this, especially as many may find separation from work in the field, which we're often encouraged to do, impossible in many situations and for many people. We're often told to leave work on campus or at the office. However, for many who research the far right, this is impossible due to the positionality, the nature of the topic, and who they may be and what positions they might hold in society. Researching individuals or groups that spew racism and xenophobia, for example, may be very difficult to leave at the office. And due to these reasons, some scholars have complicated this idea of separation of the researcher from the field by placing the individual into the research process as an inalienable feature of data collection and analysis. And literature on researcher and field separation and relationships also highlights the emotional impact the field may have on scholars. And this is especially important to consider when studying the far right, as the far right often targets marginalized groups, making studying them an emotional taxing experience for those in many communities. And as a result, the possibility of complicated relationships to the data, participants in the field, some literature has considered embracing the imperfections of research, a topic that I'm going to discuss a little bit in this in this talk. Being a good enough researcher, which many scholars have highlighted, also means creating a feeling of mutual, often trust between people who are being researched and the researcher. And in this method, participants can negotiate the definitions placed on them by the researcher. That's one method some people have for negotiating and maybe emotionally taxing experiences in the field. However, as we know, when researching the far right, this is often impossible to negotiate definitions with our participants, as this would mean negotiating what it means to be far right with someone who is far right, which can be very dangerous and at times counterproductive, and we can argue sometimes morally wrong. In synopsis, the relationships researchers have with the field, how they navigate their interactions with participants, and the emotions that occur when doing research are all central to the research, and therefore leaving work at the office may be extremely difficult and may be an impossible means of self-care. Other scholars have also highlighted a way to navigate this emotionally taxing enterprise of research is by being comfortable in discomfort and ambivalence. Researchers have looked at ambivalence and have highlighted how we should be okay with discomfort of having mixed feelings about our research and its outcomes. Literature has spoken about how researchers should not shy away from unease and mixed feelings about their data and the time in the field. For example, some scholars have argued that we construct our research field analysis through our emotional responses. However, discomfort and ambivalence are also extremely emotionally taxing, and when researchers may have to sit in the space during data collection, analysis, and writing, and prolonged exposure can have consequences, as many of us have probably already experienced. Therefore, much like separation of the researcher and the field, being comfortable in ambivalence and discomfort at times is impossible for many researchers in the far right, whose communities themselves may be under attack by their own participants. And there also has been extensive research on self-care and the research process in general. And many of these studies have highlighted the need to engage in self-care practices when conducting research that looks at trauma or topics that can be significantly troubling to researchers and readers. Some of the studies have been done in the health sciences, in particular, addressing novice researchers and doctoral students' self-care practices when studying anxiety-inducing and emotionally draining and distressing topics. This emotional drain and the need to engage in self-care can be even more prominent in qualitative research, where we are engaging with participants. We might be in the field for prolonged periods of time and are ourselves tools in the research and methodological process, gaining rapport with participants and constantly hearing or reading firsthand accounts of trauma or traumatic or violent content. For example, many people who research the far right may have family members who may themselves be part of these groups or engage in far right electoral politics. Researchers are also regularly subjected to violence, emotionally and physically, by far right participants. Self-care and the idea engaging, therefore, in restorative practices may then seem inefficient and ineffective to individuals who may be at the very sharp end of far-right violence. Far-right researchers may also be harassed by their own participants, may have to read and engage with racist, xenophobic, transphobic, and homophobic content about their own communities when they're researching the far right. And being able to separate yourself from work is also a privilege, being able to do that. So it's a privilege often to not be significantly changed by the discrimination or trauma that you experience in the field. It is also a privilege not to share this phenomenon in general. This is all the more evident for individuals who live near or with participants. For example, researchers who study far right or conservative groups in the same town that they live in, or even in major cities, you may still run into participants long after fieldwork. I have done research in many different cities, in big cities, and have run into my participants on the metro, and navigating that is extremely complicated sometimes. So because self-care practices and because research separation, which we're often told to do, are not possible, an alternative to counter research fatigue and trauma when studying the far right is through community building. Community may also counter isolation and loneliness in the field when we're in the field. Academia and the research enterprise in general have not been immune to the neoliberalization of the university, which we've spoken about in the other talks as well. Through this process, scholars have been conditioned to the idea that research should be done alone, and meaning it is often an isolating endeavor. Scholars are typically left alone to cope with the trauma and the stress of the research process. Often, sometimes ethical considerations and ethical reviews require that of us. However, the ability to separate the self from the field and heal through research is difficult and isolating, as I have discussed above. So this is even more prominent when we're looking at topics such as researching the far right, which inherently results in researchers being exposed to violent content or violent people. Forming research communities as spaces of healing and support is just one way to mediate this isolation and the trauma of the research process. And scholars have investigated the meaning of community space and support during research and writing. For example, again, as we have spoken about in the other talks, feminist researchers have really highlighted the need for supportive communities and mentorship and reflexivity in the research relationship to counter many things, including the neoliberalization of the university and the research process. So subverting the neoliberal idea of the academy as a space of competition, also where one student or professor must beat out another one for promotions, grants, or jobs, means also highlighting what care looks like in the academy. Research has shown, especially for marginalized communities, having a supportive network of peers and mentors to discuss problems that may arise in funding and research is crucial to well-being. However, there are many barriers to seeking this community that are often very felt by marginalized communities. Care in these spaces, therefore, needs to be open, have open communication, support, and mentorship. And this is very important in far right studies as researchers from all levels may face emotional difficulty. So moving forward, it will be vital for far right researchers to undertake such a compassionate turn towards community and away from research isolation. However, also giving the consideration that this is a very difficult task and many people may feel excluded from this community building, and that is something that we're always going to have to work at. So by doing so, individuals who research the far right can foster strong support systems which can assist in emotional trauma that may be inflicted on the research process. Alternatively, people who research the far right would benefit from a community-led healing and support to ensure intellectual insights in a safe environment. Often an element of the research process that has been studying the far right we often miss out on, as safety in our research may be multi-layered, especially with ethical reviews. Care in communities also may look very different for every individual. However, providing supportive peer and supervisor mentorship and a space to speak about problems that arise during the research, including feelings of ambivalence and fear and even anger, may be a step forward in assisting far-right researchers in their pursuits. Finally, community building is also a form of resistance against the far right. Because these groups often seek to separate, divide, ostracize, and hate, coming together among ourselves and building communities of trust and understanding is a step towards this, a step against this exclusivity. And I just want to thank you all for listening. And there's my contact if you have any other questions outside of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyla, for this presentation. Once again, I think you raised a really important point and question, and this idea that self-care practices are not necessarily accessible to all. I think that this is very important to remember, that it remains a privilege to be able to engage in self-care practices. And of course, the role of community. And I think that this is one of the things that we're trying to do with this webinar as well, create this network or some sort of feeling of community, even though we only meet on Zoom once a month. And I hope that it's a step forward that we're doing here with this webinar series. we're going to open the floor now for the Q&A session. I see that there's already question in the Q&A, so we're going to start right away. But if you have any question, please do not hesitate. Write them down in the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Okay, so we have a first question here saying, well, first, thank you so much for your presentation. Complicated question. So, traumatic harm can occur when a researcher is threatened, but also when their core beliefs are challenged. So, is there existing research that studies which core beliefs that researchers see challenged by their work? So, example of challenged belief, well, my institution generally support my safety, or the world is a fundamentally just place, or my work is meaningfully keeping people safer, etc. So if anyone wants to start thinking, it can be just thinking out loud or start addressing this question, you are more than welcome to do so.